Hello and welcome to a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate. I'm François Picard. Is it already too late? Is the great collapse already in motion? Even the ominous chants of Extinction Rebellion activists who shut down the heart of London in October may sound overly optimistic to those who claim we've already passed the tipping point beyond which the overheating and overpolluting of the planet can only accelerate. Their argument, instead of trying to save our way of life, policymakers need to prepare now for a world with higher sea levels, more extreme temperatures, fewer resources, fewer species, a world where politicians can no longer promise better jobs, higher wages, more stuff. Then there are those who discard doomsday prophets, who insist you can go green and continue to grow. Their argument, it'll be technology to the rescue. Already, they say, we're exceeding expectations when it comes to harnessing renewable energy. Save our way of life or prepare for the new normal? At least both sides will agree on one thing, and that is that drastic action is needed, fast. How drastic? Will the surge of green parties in Europe herald a new kind of bottom-up democratic resurgence? Or can only a top-down, China-like authoritarian state impose the drastic measures needed for drastic times? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the argument over what's called the Great Collapse. With us, he was studying finance when Julien Woznitsa turned to activism. He's the co-founder of Wings of the Ocean, the author of Why Everything is Going to Collapse. Thank you for joining us from Forbach in Alsace in the east of France.
Hello everybody.
Also,
Great to be here.
Thanks for being with us. Also with us, Anthony Cox, Deputy Director of the Environment Department at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, based here in Paris.
Thank you. Welcome, and thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show. Welcome as well to political philosopher Catherine Larère, Professor Emeritus at Panthéon-Sorbonne University, and the co-author of Thinking the Anthropocene. What's the Anthropocene?
The Anthropocene is a new geological era.
The era of humanity, if you will.
By its name, yes.
Yeah.
And it means more or less things you were saying, that the Earth has globally changed.
Right.
And so we are no longer in the Holocene period when things were moderate, climate was moderate, and you could foresee in advance what to do. We have to face unexpected events.
Yeah,
but it doesn't mean collapse necessarily.
No, it just means that never before have we had in the history of this blue marble one species that has actually reworked the landscape literally. With us, France 24 science editor Merit Dundas. This is kind of your remit, isn't it? Looking at how that's happening. Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, forget prophets of doom. The future is now. It was the start of UN Week in New York back in September. A 16-year-old girl who once and for all ended that argument on whether climate change is real.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones.
Do you think when they booked Greta Thunberg for that climate summit that they thought she would turn on the room in that way, Merit Dundas?
I think they knew what they were expecting. In fact, don't forget that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, also himself uses very strong words. He's lobbying particularly hard for a UN leader, using very prescriptive language to world leaders. So I think they knew very well what Greta was expected to bring.
Has one girl changed the conversation?
My personal opinion is Greta has absolutely changed the conversation. She's mobilized the youth movement who are going to vote, who are going to make the leaders answerable. And so I would say absolutely she has changed the discussion around climate change. I've covered it for 10 years and I haven't seen as much movement. COP21 was probably the other moment where we had so much movement and discussion and momentum, but Greta's arrival a year ago has really been the second catalyst.
Julien Vosnitsa, is the conversation changing in the direction you'd like to see it go?
The conversation has changed. Nothing has changed through the act. None of the countries that needed to act acted really. None of the politics that needed to act acted really. So yeah, they can speak about it. They can sign agreements. Like the COP21, they signed agreements about keeping under 2 degrees and 1.5. But now we know that this objective is not going to be followed. So, I mean, they can speak whatever they want to say, but at some point, they need to act. And the problem is that we really lack of act about climate change.
All right, and we're gonna. By the way, we're gonna try to call you back just to get a better audio connection there with Forbach in Alsace. So there, you heard the skepticism, Anthony Cox. There has been change. We've seen it in places. Well, we've seen it with the start of renewable energy policies, but we see it in other ways too. 2019 was the year Indonesia decided to move its capital. President Joko Widodo announcing the relocation of 1.5 million civil servants from Jakarta to the eastern edge of Borneo Island. The more central location could reinforce political unity, but also Jakarta is built on a swamp. And if you're watching the show from Lagos, Miami, Shanghai, Amsterdam, even South London, this graph will seem very familiar. Anthony Cox, is it more the kind of provisions that we're seeing from the Indonesians that is, well, let's move and get to higher ground, or is there still hope for that 1.5% keeping the overheating of the planet from getting out of control?
I think it's clear that we have to acknowledge that there's been a lot of technology advancement. I mean, as you said, solar energy, wind energy is now much cheaper than fossil fuel-related energy. We've seen huge technological advances. We've seen huge innovations in finance. We've seen a lot of action in cities trying to adapt and take mitigation actions as well. The kind of things we're seeing in Indonesia with retreat is something that is going to have to be part of our game plan going forward. But it's, I think we can do a lot more.
Such as?
Before that. Well, I think we certainly can continue to implement a lot of technology innovations, both across the energy side, but also in things like finance, harness the digital revolution, look at how we structure our cities. The cities of the future, the cities in 2050 will look radically different to the way they look now. We'll have more electrification, we're looking for electric fleets, buses, transport, and so on. The way in which people work 20 years down the track is going to be different. More teleworking, so we can have quite a different setup then. So I think the signs are very good that we've got some of the technological innovations now that are going to make a big difference. But we have to double down on that, I think.
Catherine Lara?
That's right, that we cannot do anything without technology, and that we need new technology, that we need to give up fossil fuels and things like that. But I don't think technology is enough. I don't think that linking technology and market is enough. That we need to change more deeply our way of life. Because, for instance, if you take electricity for cars, that's right that cars with electricity do not emit much CO2, but they need emission of CO2 to be produced. So if you want to make them useful for the climate, you have, for instance, to use them collectively. that is personally owned electric cars are of no real use. So it needs more change than only relying on technological innovation and markets.
More change and
In the way of life.
And are we promising too much? Even if we do factor in the actual CO2 cost, if we don't greenwash, as we say. For instance, we heard Greta Thunberg at the beginning of the show. They've stopped giving each other Christmas presents in her family.
Why not? But I'm not sure it's enough. I mean the problem is that climate change is a very complex phenomenon, and we cannot see it only from top down. We cannot see it only as a global phenomenon requiring international agreement. It's also a bottom-up phenomenon with many people changing their life and doing in some way ecology without naming it ecology. And this is very important. I mean, people are fighting all through the earth on issues which are both ecological, economical, and social. You know, what's called environmental justice. And it's grassroots action, not only down.
Very hard to change, right? Because we've
But it's changing for the moment.
It is changing.
It is if you take what happens, not much in Brazil, but in place where indigenous people don't want the forest to be cut, it's grassroots ecology. And you have many places, you had in India, a place like that with mobilization from women against the cutting of the forests. So I think we must take both the way governments do or not, strive or not to reduce.
How to make it bottom up. For France 24's Down to Earth show, Mary Dundas traveled to Cantal and the backroads of southern France.
Okay.
Alors, je suis Bénédicte.
Je m'appelle Rémi.
Et nous habitons dans un petit village du Cantal. On a 3 enfants et on pratique l'école à la maison. Nous sommes une famille qui vise l'autonomie et la résilience. C'est pas un jour où on s'est réveillé en se disant tiens, si on devenait collapsologue, collapsonaute, non. C'est quelque chose qui s'est construit dans nos choix de vie, dans notre fonctionnement. Voilà, il y a un terme aujourd'hui qui correspond à ce qu'on fait. Et voilà, on a cette étiquette-là.
L'autonomie permet de se dire qu'on va être moins dépendant de cette société qui, elle, va être déséquilibrée par ce changement climatique. Au départ, c'est surtout l'alimentation. On a l'habitat, évidemment. Après, c'est l'énergie. Donc, on essaie de produire un maximum de notre énergie nous-mêmes. C'est les panneaux solaires et une petite éolienne qui nous produisent ce dont on a besoin.
Il y a la santé. Apprendre à se soigner avec ce qu'on trouve dans notre jardin, finalement, parce qu'on a des plantes locales qui sont très, très efficaces. On n'a pas besoin d'éléments extérieurs pour ça. Pour nous, ça, c'est primordial. C'est l'action, c'est le fait de faire et d'interagir avec ces changements-là et ce climat qui on ne sait pas trop où ça va nous amener, mais ça nous permet de ne pas avoir cette anxiété-là et pas avoir ces angoisses.
So, Mary Dundas, those are what we call in French collapseologists.
Exactly, which is interesting because it's a word that's used very much in French, collapsologue, collapseologist.
And it's an English word.
Well, so
it's
the French took the word from the English, now the English are taking it back from the French. But basically, we had a lot of discussion around this idea of collapseologist versus survivalist, which is obviously another group of people who expect environmental doom linked to climate change and the disruption of society. And she was very insistent on the fact that if she was going to be called a survivalist, it had to be a cooperative survivalist, meaning that she was trying to bring other people on this path towards energy independence, food independence. And they talked a lot about we talked about personal sacrifices or personal efforts. They talked a lot about reducing our level of comfort by 8. So what does that mean? They were talking about taking a shower perhaps every second day, doing things, not using heating in the house, taking the bike even when it rains and not the car. And they were talking about not technology, relying on technology, but at an individual level, we need to reduce our level of comfort by 8.
Julien Vosnica, are you a collapseologist?
It depends. Like I've been. The term has been brought to me when I wrote my book, but I'm not in this kind of collapseologist. But collectively, we need to think about we need to ask ourselves some questions, like what do we do if the supermarket close to us is not delivered for 5 days? What do we do if we don't have like electricity on our house for 3 days? Or what do we do if we don't have tap water for at least 2 days? What are we going to do in those conditions? And most importantly, like, what are we going to do if like both of those 3 things are happening at the same time? And most of the time, like in France, no one has any solution about it. So if I don't get any electricity for 3 days, I cannot communicate. I cannot basically heat myself, because most of the heating in France is done by electricity and oil, and fuel. So yeah, we need to ask ourselves like how much we are dependent on this system, and what happens if this system fails.
All right, we'll be putting those questions to you, Julien, when we come back. We're going to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching a special edition of the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate. I'm François Picard, and we're looking perhaps at the end of the world as we know it. We're about the great collapse, as it's been theorized. For some, it's not a theory in certain parts of the world already. And about collapseologists is what we're talking about, that term that was coined by French people but has now gone global. With us from the eastern French city of Forbach, Julien Vosnica, environmental activist with Wings of the Ocean and the author of Why Everything is Going to Collapse. Thanks for being back with us. Thanks as well to Anthony Cox, Deputy Director of the Environment Department at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, based here in Paris. Catherine Larère, Professor Emeritus at Panthéon-Sorbonne University, and the co-author of Thinking the Anthropocene, the Age That We Live in. France 24 science editor Merit Dundas, who went to the southern Cantal region and met people who were... How much were they really off the grid?
Well, they were connected to EDF. They said that the house...
EDF is the electric...
yeah. But they said that they don't use any of the energy. It's just, it's set up that way and they're ready at some point to either cut. But there's actually a law in France that most houses in villages need to be connected to the electricity provider. But for the moment, they provide all of their own energy.
Okay, so there was a cover story a few weeks back, Julien Vosnica, in one of the big French newsweekly magazines, L'Obs, talking about the Great Collapse. And it poses the questions that you were asking just before the break. And how are you preparing? You say we actually all need to prepare for the eventuality of supermarkets being shut, the water being cut, the electricity going off.
Yeah, the problem is that like we cannot prepare ourselves just ourselves. We need to prepare collectively on small scale. So it's like on a village, on a 2 or 3 village. It's like building communities of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 people that are going to have like all the competencies needed. So
Is that something you're
we cannot,
personally active in?
it's really hard to prepare only by ourselves. Like we need to do it collectively, because if you are only yourself with like a stock of food or a stock of water or anything, the day that we have shortages in the supermarket, everyone is going to come at your house and basically see that you have a stock of food, so asking you to give them food. So we need to prepare like on a collective scale, and for like 5,000 people is like the best scale, I think so. And in order to prepare to create our own food, so then we don't starve the day the day the supermarket are not going to provide us food.
Catherine Larère?
Yes, may I ask a question? Why do you prepare to this kind of accident? Why don't you prepare to the more likely accident to happen, which is a nuclear accident, such as Fukushima or Chernobyl? What is more likely to happen is this kind of accident. So why do you choose a certain kind of collapse and not other ones?
Because I basically made lots of research about how about how a nuclear central works, and
nuclear specialists say that the question is not will it happen, whether it happens. The question is when. So why do you not think of this kind of accident?
Yeah, but like we can have an accident in a nuclear power plant, but it's not going to be essentially like a huge explosion that is going to destroy everything.
Not necessarily. So
there's a huge difference between. So
there is nothing to do.
That there's not going to be any electricity. But for nuclear power, there's not too much to do. There's not too much to prepare. You cannot really prepare yourself about a nuclear problem. You can maybe migrate in the south hemisphere because there's less nuclear power plants there. But yeah, there's not too much to do in Europe about nuclear. You can. That's another thing. You were talking just before about electrical cars. Electrical cars need, of course, rare materials and are producing CO2 in order to produce them. But afterwards, like when you plug the electrical car, you need electricity to go to the car and in order for her to drive. So at the same time, we don't want any nuclear power, and at the same time, we want to shut down the coal power plants. We have like the electricity consumption is going higher and higher, and then the production of electricity is not going as high. So we are facing a kind of a problem now in these kind of things as well.
That brings us to Anthony Cox, the tipping point. The tipping point after which, first of all, there isn't going to be enough raw materials to fuel our energy needs.
Well, I think Julian raised three really critical issues. One is systems. He talked about systems. This is a systemic issue. So climate system is linked to biodiversity, is linked to ocean system. And so what we're looking at is how a system as a whole is connected. And there's certainly increasing evidence that we're heading towards a kind of a global cascade of tipping points. Mm-hmm. We may be in some right now. Lots of evidence that the West Antarctic ice sheet is collapsing. That'll have an impact on the ocean levels. There's evidence that we're already seeing the Arctic ice melting. This is going to have this is starting to warm the North Atlantic, which is having an impact on the circulation, which is going to have an impact on the monsoon season in Africa, which will have an impact on the droughts in the Sahel, and then that'll have an impact then down in the Southern Ocean and the sub-Antarctic. So all these things are connected. So it is a systems issue, and we need a systems response. The second thing is scale. Julian is focused very much around the local. He's focusing on 5,000 people a group, but this is a global problem. We have to have collective action at the global level, and so agreements like the Paris Agreement are important. It doesn't go far enough. We need to do a lot more, and I think there's general agreement on that. But you need action at the global level. You need action at the personal level, like with Greta not having Christmas presents and things like that. So there's personal responsibility and global collective responsibility. And then the third issue he mentioned was that of the collective action. And we're seeing that a number of countries are really taking the bit between their teeth and doing actions to enhance the climate that not only enhance the climate but also enhance the well-being of their communities for things like air pollution, health, increased education. That has an impact on the ability of countries to take on climate action.
All right, but there's the overriding, within the three factors, there is the overriding issue, which is the question of changing our lifestyles, be it at the local or national level. Back in 1972, a U.S. scientist published The Limits of Growth, warning that surging global population was bringing humanity to a tipping point. He predicted it was somewhere between 2020 and 2030. Still today, Dennis Meadows warns politicians don't want to speak the truth and voters don't want to hear it.
Could you change your cultural and your social norms in a way that gave an attractive future? Yes, you could. It will be in a future which much lower energy and material use, but of course, most of the important things in life don't require energy and material. They're knowledge, learning, music. These are things which can be done with much lower levels of energy and material flow. Will you choose to do that? I don't see any reason to think that you will. It seems to me the leaders of the West, of the industrialized West, are desperately trying to do everything they can to maintain the current situation. So that means you won't avoid the collapse.
So Anthony Cox, your employers, you're not quite a think tank, the OECD. It's different.
We're more than that. We're a do tank. We set standards.
So your employers are the participatory nations, right? So they're asking for both. You, OECD, give us tips on how to manage this energy transition, but also how can we grow our economies? And they're still asking for both. And that's still what they want from you, right? That's your mandate.
Well, certainly it's part of our mandate is to pursue economic growth, but it's as much about the quality of growth as much as the quantity of growth. We are taking a much more holistic version of a holistic look at what the type of growth that we're pursuing, so that we look much more at well-being.
And from that clip, you can guess what Dennis Meadows' answer would be to that.
So we have to look at the material consumption that we have, that we're enjoying. I think there's certainly scope for thinking very, very carefully about how individuals live their lives and how the communities live their lives.
Catherine Larère, how much are we going to have to change our lives?
Depends. But life is changing already. You know, you have in France lots of farmers who are going from industrial farming to organic farming. So things are changing maybe more than we think. Yes, because it's not only a matter of global negotiation and personal changement. Julian is right. You need collective action, but it does not necessarily mean small groups living on themselves far from the other.
No.
going from industrial agriculture to organic agriculture is a very interesting way of changing, and it's becoming organic agriculture is becoming economically sound. It's not only a matter of wanting to live this way. You can earn a good life with
Julien,
something like that.
Votre Sina?
Yeah.
No, but do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I'm not about like being all in communities of 5,000 people, and of course I know that there's like a global political aspect of this systemic collapse, and of that we need to take decision on a political level and global level, and as well on a small scale level on how to prepare life for after petrol, after coal, after gas, because 92% of our energy consumption right now on Earth, 92% is gas, coal, and petrol. So
92%.
if we want to do, it's 92% of the world global consumption of energy. If we want to avoid those three energy sources, we need to cut down our emissions. We need to cut down like our consumptions of energy by a factor like 12 or 11, and that's not going to be the case for now. So of course we need to prepare ourselves on a global level and on a small level, on a global scale and on a smaller scale.
And that brings up
in order to
and that brings up the other question.
To survive the fact.
To survive, you're saying.
Yep.
That brings up the other question, which is how do you do it? Do you do it with carrot or stick? Take a look. 7 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world today are in northern India. And 3 of the top 4, by the way, surround the capital, New Delhi, if you look at that list. A few years back, Merit Dundas, we were talking about China all the time. China, which is still building coal plants, let's not glorify. But with their top-down approach, an authoritarian state, if they decide to do an energy transition, there's not many environmental impact studies that are going to get in their way. Whereas in India, it's a different kettle of fish. So the question is, the times ahead, are we going to have more or less democracy as we're forced to make these changes?
Well, I think you're right that we've really shifted our focus from China to India. Mind you, China is really playing a double game right now at the moment in terms of their climate efforts. We're not going to give them too much credit, though India is being much more open in terms of their progression. They're admitting that they're not willing to make extra efforts on the climate. That's in the face of the pollution we've seen in recent months, and we're wondering whether we're going to see a similar backlash or uprising amongst the population in the same way that we've seen in China, where there's been a lot of pressure from the Chinese. But in India, on the other hand, a democratic country, and
as we approach the tipping points that Anthony was talking about earlier, India and China can be a parable for the whole planet, which, in the sense that it's the question of, are we going to rethink?
But China is one of the more polluted countries in the world.
Right. But what's the future hold in terms of how we organize ourselves as humans? You heard Julien at the part 1 of our discussion talking about how we need to think locally in terms of how we're organized. The way humanity organized itself was rethought when the Industrial Revolution came about. Are we in the same kind of rethinking of how we organize ourselves and what kind of politics we want?
I think we need to go more quickly now than in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution took something like 1.5 centuries, and even 2 centuries. We need to act quite more quickly. But
and will there be more or less democracy at the end of it?
I don't think so. Because I don't.
You don't think there'll be either?
I don't think it's an either or question. I think that I think that you don't do much with authority. So take Singapore, for instance. It's a very clean city. You cannot drop something on the
Pavement.
without having a fine, but it's not much as a matter of doing ecologically. So if you want to change ecologically speaking, you need that the people to agree. That people won't do that against their will. So you need people agreement.
The dystopian vision of a future, like in a Mad Max movie, Anthony Cox, it's overblown?
I think it's misguided. I think there is no evidence at all that authoritarian regimes are more environmentally active or friendly or effective than democratic institutions are. I think the advantages of democratic regimes are that they are more innovative, more dynamic, more responsive. There's greater transparency, greater involvement. You have movements like Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg. They would not be visible in a authoritarian regime. That's not to say that democracies don't have their disadvantages. We have to overcome the inertia of special interests, particularly in the fossil fuel sector. The fossil fuel industry in the OECD countries gets around $600 billion in subsidies each year. That could be much better spent and would accelerate our transition to a low emission future if we abolish those. I mean, that's free money.
But we saw recently what happened in Iran and in India when they tried to ease those restrictions. It provoked an immediate backlash from working class people.
Sure, you have to be very clever about the way you introduce them. We have seen other countries, though, wind back their subsidies. We've seen that in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Indonesia. It took several goes, but they figured out how to do it. You promise the population what you will gain. You target those subsidies much better. You link it to the needs and not to which part of the society you come from. Most of the subsidies in those countries go to the well-off, to the middle classes.
Julien Vostnica, you mentioned at the outset of our show, you're making contingency plans in case it all goes wrong. You're 25 years old. How do you see the future? Is it going to be more or less democratic, or do you agree with Catherine Larère that that's not really, it doesn't really have to be either or?
There's one thing, like, obviously France is not a democracy. Like, thinking that France is actually a good democracy, it's a perfect lie. We are not in a democracy. Like 82% of the French people are against hunting. They're still hunting. Like a lot of people are going on strikes against like the government for there's been Gilets jaunes for more than 1 year, and there's still like this government staying. So there's no democracy right now in France.
But do you see more or less democracy in your future as it becomes more tense ecologically?
I can see more democracy. Yeah, I can see more democracy on a small scale. That's why I was talking about 5,000 people, because if you trust the people and if you know the people, personally, if you know the people, then you can have a democracy on a small scale. Like after in the future, with like less and less resources, having a democracy on a big scale might be really, really difficult to have.
Catherine Larère?
I'm not so sure that as he is, but I think we won't do anything without democracy. And I think that the big problem might be with the social inequalities. A great hindrance to bettering the ecological policies is because of inequalities. First, poor people do not are not ready to fight for another life. And then some rich people profit a lot of the present crisis. So I think the social and the ecological are strongly connected and must be better together.
Absolutely. Yes.
No, it makes me think of just the Yellow Vest movement slogan, if you will. We're not worried about the end of the planet, we're worried about the end of the month. And it's really a perfect way of summing up the social inequalities.
And do you see that there's been a more holistic approach from when you first started covering climate conferences a decade ago?
I think we talk a lot more about social equality, but does it actually filter down to the policies? No, not yet. There's a lot more talk about it.
Anthony Cox?
I think that exactly right. The social inequality and environmental justice go hand in hand. I think we're talking a lot more about it. We are at the OECD doing a lot more work on bringing together the inclusive growth agenda and the green growth agenda. And I think our countries are starting to pay a lot more attention to that. We have to do a lot more to get a really integrated and holistic approach. But it's certainly on the agenda. And if there's economic inequality, that will hamper people's willingness to undertake collective action, either at the small scale, 5,000 people, at the national level and at the global level. I think that's something that we really have to address.
And then there's, of course, cheer up, it may never happen attitude to the future. We could show you a 2017 cartoon from the New Yorker magazine by U.S. artist Peter Cooper. You know the old adage, Anthony Cox, that economists are great at predicting the past. It's really tough here because we've spent the whole hour speculating on what may or may not happen.
It is tough, and it is one of the things that economists are also well known for is we have two hands. So on the one hand, I think there's a lot of optimism, a lot of hope out there. We're seeing a lot of action. On the other hand, it's not enough to avoid the tipping points. We need to double down on our efforts, both politically and technologically in terms of investments. So we have a dual approach. That's the advantage of being an economist.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Anthony. Julien Vostnica, very quickly.
We have, with my non-profit organization, we have a solution in order to avoid more plastic to go into the ocean. Like, it's been 2 years that I'm providing this solution on a global scale to put like barrage at the end of like the deltas of the river mouth. And we are asking for fundings in order to implement this solution, and nothing is coming. We are asking like governments, we are asking like billionaires in order to finance it, and like nothing is coming about that.
Yeah, filters at river mouths. We'll leave it with that appeal, and I want to thank you, Julien Vostnica, for joining us from Forbach in eastern France. I want to thank as well Catherine Larère, Merritt Dundas, Anthony Cox. Thank you for joining us here for this special year-end edition of the France 24 debate.